intended. And so what Mark does theologically is really quite extraordinary. We begin to realize that it is the very suffering of Jesus, in all of its very concrete horror, that is the glory of the Lord. Now, John's Gospel, we use language like that. In the case of Mark, we don't have this language so much, but rather we have the reality that Jesus' actions here are seen as something very important in the identity of Jesus. And I'd like to suggest that this reality of the importance of Jesus' willingness to give himself over in faithfulness to the Father, even to the point of accepting suffering and death, is really found throughout the Gospel. Remember, a passion narrative with an introduction. So, for example, if you think way back in chapter 1 of the healing of the leper, we have Jesus taking a person who is, in the eyes of that society, really the living dead, the walking dead, cut off from all human intercourse. Of course, in that time, that is, in effect, a death sentence, right? So we have the leper who is really already dead. He is, in a sense, raised to life by Jesus' healing of his leprosy. But notice that Jesus touches the man to heal him. Of course, he doesn't have to do that. We know that in the gospel, that Jesus' power does not require him to make physical contact. But it's significant here because, of course, the touching of a leper who is unclean renders the one who touches them unclean. So what I'd like to suggest here is that we have, in a sense, a miniature story of Jesus' redemptive act on the cross. Jesus touches the leper and takes the uncleanliness onto himself, liberating the leper from death, restoring him to life. Likewise, of course, that's metaphorical then for Jesus' death on the cross, in which he takes upon himself our sin, our death, in order to liberate us from the power of death. I think this is also another background issue when we get to moments like the Transfiguration, when we do see the glory of the Lord, but even there we have hints of his destiny to suffer and die. But above all, it is the cross itself that reveals its importance for Mark. Here, notice that in Mark's Gospel, the emphasis is on the fact that Jesus is utterly abandoned by all family and friends, and, in his own words, really abandoned by God. And that, on the surface, is rather shocking, until you realize the nature of what Jesus is accomplishing here. In the Old Testament, the great unfinished story is that of the unfaithfulness of humanity matched by the faithfulness of God. So we have at the very beginning of the story a rupture that opens a gap between humanity and God, one that results in alienation between people and between people and creation. And that gap remains through the whole story. Even though God remains ever faithful, human beings never manage to give back to God what God has given to them, until Jesus, who in the garden submits himself to the divine will, and then we see him carry that out on the cross. And what's interesting here, if you look at Mark's witness, is that Jesus doesn't have here the conceptual assurance or perfect knowledge of his deliverance. What he has is only his faith in God. He relies entirely on God. And he submits himself, surrenders himself in love to the Father, returning to the Father perfect trust, perfect faithfulness on the cross. This is why it's so essential that he be abandoned by the Father, so that what he has is only his faith. And in this, he heals the breach, or bridges the breach, I should say, and allows the possibility of its healing for the rest of us. So in Mark's Gospel, theologically speaking, the Messiah must suffer. This is in fact part of God's will. The human misunderstanding that occurs in the Gospel can't stand in the face of this. But you understand now why the people don't get it. It's not obvious. It runs contrary to their expectations. And the fact is that they're not really going to understand God's will in this matter until they see that perfect act of love on the cross. So the human beings, in effect, must misunderstand throughout the gospel. This is the reason why the centurion can only identify Jesus after he has died as the Son of God. And the gospel here establishes then a clear link for the reader or listener between the identity of Jesus as Messiah and beloved Son and his destiny to suffer and die. In effect, what Mark has done now is he's turned the objection to Jesus' status into the very proof of his exalted nature as Son of God. And in doing so, I think, gives hope and consolation to a community that is itself suffering, perhaps even feeling alone and abandoned, standing as Jesus did on the cross before that abyss and having nothing other than their trust in the Lord. Here Jesus gives them a powerful example and teaches them to understand his presence in that moment with them.